He thought bringing his mistress into his own home was a final proof of his power. But that night, his house was empty, his wife was gone, and the secret she left behind would destroy everything he built. What happened next wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was calculated, silent, and irreversible. Watch till the end to see how one woman's quiet exit collapsed an entire empire. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories like this. Victor Adebayo had always believed success was proof of intelligence, and intelligence was permission to do whatever he wanted. At 42, he was a name people whispered with admiration in Lagos boardrooms, a real estate mogul whose projects changed skylines and whose confidence filled every room before he did. To the outside world, he was a self-made man with a disciplined wife and a flawless life, but behind the tinted windows of his luxury SUV, Victor had already rewritten the story in his head. Amora, his wife of 11 years, had become invisible to him, not because she nagged or embarrassed him, but because she didn't compete for attention. She spoke softly, asked thoughtful questions, and listened more than she talked, traits Victor had once admired but now mistook for weakness. In contrast, Nina was fire. She laughed loudly, dressed boldly, and made Victor feel like a prize every time she looked at him. Their affair had started as a thrill, secret lunches, and late-night hotel rooms, but Victor's ego demanded escalation. He wanted proof of dominance, proof that he could rewrite his life whenever he chose, and bringing Nina into his marital home felt like the ultimate declaration of victory. He told himself Amora would cry, beg, maybe threaten, but in the end she would stay, because where would she go, and what could she possibly do without him? As he drove home that evening with Nina beside him, her hand resting confidently on his arm, Victor felt untouchable. He imagined Amora's shocked face, the power shift, the moment he would finally feel free without losing anything. In his mind, this wasn't cruelty, it was evolution. He had outgrown the quiet woman who stood behind him, and he was ready to step into a louder, flashier future. What Victor didn't realize was that while he was busy celebrating his imagined triumph, Amora had already finished the game he thought he was still playing. Nina had rehearsed this moment more times than she would ever admit. Sitting in Victor's car as they approached the mansion gates, she straightened her dress, checked her reflection in the mirror, and reminded herself to look calm even though her heart was racing. For months, she had existed in the margins of Victor's life, hidden phone calls, sudden cancellations, excuses that always ended with promises of soon. Tonight felt different. Tonight, she was crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. When Victor told her they were going to his house, not a hotel, not a rented apartment, but the home he shared with his wife, Nina felt chosen. She imagined herself walking through the rooms, leaving her presence behind like perfume, claiming territory that had never been hers. Victor spoke confidently as they drove, dismissing Amora as predictable, saying she would understand eventually, saying women like her stayed because stability mattered more than pride. Nina nodded, wanting to believe every word, because believing meant her sacrifices had meaning. She had ignored red flags, endured secrecy, defended Victor in her mind when friends warned her she was just a distraction. Tonight was supposed to validate her patience. As the car slowed at the gates, Nina noticed something odd. No lights, no guard stepping forward, no familiar hum of a busy household. Victor frowned briefly but waved it off, blaming a power issue, already irritated at the idea of inconvenience. Nina, however, felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. Something about the silence felt deliberate, like a pause before an announcement. Still, she stepped out of the car with her head high, heels clicking against the driveway, determined to look like a woman who belonged there. She didn't know it yet, but this house was not welcoming her. It was closing a chapter that would leave both her and Victor exposed in ways neither of them had prepared for. The moment Victor pushed the front door open, the silence pressing on them, thick and unnatural. The mansion that usually echoed with staff movements, background music, and the soft efficiency Amora insisted on maintaining felt hollow, like a stage after the audience had left. Victor stepped inside first, calling Amora's name with a tone that carried more irritation than concern, expecting an immediate response. None came. Nina followed, her earlier excitement fading as she noticed details that didn't fit Victor's narrative. The walls were bare in places where art once hung. Shelves that should have been filled with books were half empty, and the air smelled clean in a way that suggested finality rather than routine cleaning. Victor walked faster, checking rooms, his confidence slowly cracking as each space confirmed the same truth. Amora was gone. Not temporarily, not dramatically, but methodically. Nina stood near the living room, unsure where to place herself, suddenly aware that she was an intruder in a moment that wasn't meant for her. Victor told himself Amora was trying to scare him, that she would be back by morning, but the house told a different story. Drawers were empty, closets cleared with precision, personal items removed without chaos. This wasn't the act of a woman reacting emotionally. It was a work of someone who had planned. Nina noticed a single envelope placed neatly on the dining table, scented as if waiting. Victor hesitated before picking it up, a strange unease settling into his chest. He didn't know why, but for the first time that night, the power he thought he held felt distant. Nina watched him carefully, realizing that this was not the victory she had imagined. Whatever was happening, it wasn't about her becoming the new woman of the house. It was about something ending in a way Victor clearly hadn't anticipated. Victor opened the envelope slowly, his fingers betraying a tension he refused to acknowledge. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no tears, no angry handwriting, just clean, deliberate words printed neatly as if drafted in an office rather than a home. Amora's message was calm to the point of cruelty. She thanked Victor for the years they shared, wished him clarity in his new choices, and ended with a line that made his breath hitch. "I hope you enjoy the house tonight. Everything else now belongs to me." Victor laughed out loud, a sharp, dismissive sound meant to reassure himself and Nina that this was nothing more than drama. He scoffed at the idea that Amora could take anything significant from him, reminding himself of his wealth, his influence, his connections. Nina forced a smile, but her eyes lingered on the note, sensing the weight behind the words. Amora had not begged, accused, or explained. She had concluded. That terrified Nina more than anger ever could. Victor crumpled the paper and tossed it aside, declaring they would discuss things in the morning, insisting on pouring drinks as if routine could erase unease. Yet beneath his bravado, something was shifting. His phone buzzed once, then again, notifications lighting up the screen. He ignored them at first, but Nina noticed a color drain from his face when he finally looked. The house felt colder, the silence a dur, and the note's message replayed in his mind with increasing clarity. This was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, and Victor was about to learn that Amora had never been as powerless as he believed. The alerts kept coming, each vibration chipping away at Victor's certainty. Bank notifications, account warnings, messages marked urgent, none of which made sense to a man accustomed to financial control. He excused himself, stepping away from Nina as he made hurried calls, his voice dropping with each unanswered ring. When a customer service representative finally confirmed that several accounts had been temporarily frozen pending verification, Victor felt something close to panic for the first time in his adult life. Nina watched from a distance, her role in the evening shrinking rapidly as she realized the situation had moved far beyond an affair gone wrong. Victor tried to maintain authority, blaming errors, threatening legal action, but the calm responses on the other end of the line unsettled him. They spoke as if this had been expected. Nina remembered the note, the measured tone, the lack of emotion, and it dawned on her that Amora hadn't left impulsively. She had exited with leverage. Victor returned to the room visibly shaken, snapping at Nina when she asked what was wrong, the confidence that once drew her to him now cracking under pressure. As the night deepened, Victor sat in a house that no longer felt like his, surrounded by emptiness he could not command away. Nina felt invisible again, but this time not because she was hidden, rather because the man who once made her feel chosen was unraveling before her eyes. Somewhere beyond the walls of the mansion, Amora was already free, and Victor was only beginning to understand that the story he thought he controlled had been rewritten without him. Victor spent the rest of the night pacing the living room like a trapped animal, refreshing his banking apps, switching phones, and barking orders into voicemail boxes that refused to answer him back. By dawn, reality had stopped whispering and started screaming. Every major account tied to his real estate empire was locked under legal review, including payroll, project escrow, and operational funds that kept construction site alive. This was no glitch. This was surgical. Victor remembered the way Amora used to sit quietly at the dining table with her laptop, asking questions about structures, ownership, and long-term protection, questions he always waved away with jokes about her being too cautious. He had enjoyed feeling superior, enjoyed believing he was a mind behind everything that moved. Now the silence of the house mirrored the silence from his banks, and for the first time it occurred to him that Amora had not been asking questions for curiosity but for preparation. Nina sat on the edge of the couch watching him unravel, her excitement replaced with fear as she realized she was witnessing collapse, not a confrontation. Victor called his finance director only to discover the man had resigned 2 weeks earlier, forwarding all future correspondence to a legal firm Victor had never heard of. When he finally slammed his phone down, the sound echoed through the empty room, and in that echo was a terrifying realization that whatever Mora had done, she had done it long before tonight, long before Nina ever stepped into this house, and Victor had walked straight into the final act without knowing the play had already ended. As daylight crept through the tall windows, Victor sat alone replaying his marriage in his head, not with nostalgia but with suspicion. He remembered Amora's calm reactions to his temper, her habit of documenting conversations, her insistence on separate advisors, just in case, things he had once marked as unnecessary caution. He had mistaken her silence for submission and her patience for dependence, never asking why a woman who came from nothing, as he believed, was so uninterested in displaying wealth or power. The truth surfaced painfully as he recalled moments he had dismissed, her private phone calls that ended when he entered the room, her refusal to sign certain documents without review, her quiet resistance disguised as cooperation. Nina, listening from nearby, began to understand that Amora had never been competing with her because she had never been threatened by her. Victor had built his ego on the idea that he was the foundation of the marriage, the provider, the protector, but as he traced the timeline backward, a chilling pattern emerged. Amora had not reacted to his affair. She had anticipated it. She had not fled in humiliation. She had exited with structure. Victor's anger shifted from arrogance to dread as he realized he had underestimated the only person who truly knew him, and underestimating her had cost him everything he thought he owned. Desperate for reassurance, Victor drove straight to the office of the lawyer who had handled his affairs for over a decade, a man who knew every loophole, every shield that protected his empire. The receptionist barely looked up before informing him that the firm no longer represented him, and that all further communication must go through a newly appointed legal team representing Amora Adebayo. Victor felt the ground tilt beneath him as the words sank in. This wasn't betrayal, it was transition. His lawyer hadn't switched sides suddenly, he had been reassigned. Documents were slid across the desk outlining changes Victor had never read, signatures he had signed casually, trusts he had laughed about, and clauses that transferred authority under specific conditions. Conditions that had now been met. Victor realized with sick clarity that his power had always been conditional, and Amora had ensured she was the one who controlled the conditions. Nina waited in the car, sensing that whatever Victor was facing inside that office was irreversible. When he returned, his silence spoke louder than anger, and Nina understood that the man she thought she was aligning with had never truly been in charge. The lawyer's door closing behind Victor sounded like a verdict, and from that moment on, everything he touched began slipping further out of reach. Nina packed her bag slowly, her movements deliberate, her mind racing faster than her hands. She had entered Victor's life believing she was stepping into a position of power, replacing a woman she assumed had been tolerated rather than respected. Now she saw the truth with brutal clarity. Victor's confidence had been borrowed, his lifestyle leased, his authority symbolic rather than absolute. The house that once felt like a prize now felt like evidence of a crime she wanted no part in. Victor tried to reassure her, promising recovery, insisting this was temporary, but Nina had watched enough to know better. She had seen how men behave when control is slipping, how promises become noise. Without drama, without confrontation, she walked away, leaving Victor alone with the consequences he could no longer distract himself from. As Nina's car disappeared down the driveway, Victor realized that even the woman he brought to celebrate his dominance had abandoned him without looking back. For the first time, there was no audience, no validation, no one left to blame but himself. By the end of the week, the truth surfaced fully, stripping Victor of denial. The company he built his identity around was legally structured under a family trust established by Amora years before their marriage, a trust seeded with capital from sources Victor had never bothered to ask about. His name had been the face, the signature, the noise, but ownership had always belonged elsewhere. Board members released statements removing him from leadership with calm professionalism, citing clauses he had approved without reading. Media outlets framed the story as a quiet transition rather than a scandal, which hurt more than public humiliation ever could. Victor watched interviews where analysts praised Amora's foresight, her discipline, her refusal to react emotionally in a male-dominated industry. She was described as strategic, composed, and visionary, words Victor had never associated with her because he had never looked closely enough. As he stood in a rented apartment far removed from the mansion he once claimed as proof of success, Victor finally understood the depth of his mistake. He had not lost his wife because of infidelity. He had lost his empire because of arrogance. Amora had not ruined him out of anger. She had simply stepped aside and let the truth take its place. And in doing so, she revealed that the most dangerous thing a man can do is underestimate the woman who knows him best. The truth did not arrive all at once. It crept in through documents, conversations, and silences that Victor could no longer ignore. What he believed was his empire began unraveling thread by thread as files surfaced showing ownership structures he had never bothered to study. Years ago, when Amora insisted certain assets be placed under trust and holding companies, Victor had signed without reading, amused by what he considered unnecessary caution. Now those signatures haunted him. The core real estate firm, the land banks, the offshore reserves, all traced back to a family trust legally tied to Amora's lineage, a structure designed for longevity, not ego. Victor learned that the initial capital that launched his first self-made project did not come from luck or loans, but from Amora's silent backing, money she never used to assert dominance because she never needed validation. Board members who once laughed at Victor's jokes now spoke to him through legal representatives, explaining with detached professionalism that leadership roles were contingent on compliance clauses he had breached. There was no anger in their tone, only finality. Victor realized the empire he paraded as proof of his greatness had always rested on foundations he neither laid nor respected. His power had been real only because Amora allowed it to function through him, and the moment she withdrew, the structure corrected itself without resistance. What crushed Victor most was understanding that he had not been overthrown. He had simply been removed from a system that never truly belonged to him. Alone with too much time and too many regrets, Victor began examining the woman he had dismissed for years. He replayed conversations he once half-listened to, moments where Amora mentioned mentors, travels, and experiences he brushed aside as exaggeration or irrelevance. Digging deeper, Victor uncovered records that painted a far more complex picture: elite education abroad, early exposure to corporate governance, and a family network that valued discretion over display. Amora's calm demeanor was not insecurity, it was discipline. Her refusal to compete with Victor's ego was not submission, it was self-containment. Victor remembered how she never reacted explosively to his temper, how she documented decisions quietly, how she insisted on clarity where he preferred shortcuts. What he once marked as overthinking was revealed as foresight. The most painful realization was not that Amora was smarter than he thought, but that she had seen him clearly from the beginning, his ambition, his vanity, his blind spots, and had chosen to protect herself accordingly. Victor felt exposed knowing that while he had been chasing validation through affairs and applause, Amora had been building an exit that required no confrontation. He had never bothered to truly know her because knowing her would have required humility, and humility was the one thing his success had taught him to abandon. Victor found out about the board meeting after it had already ended, a deliberate exclusion that stripped him of dignity more effectively than public disgrace ever could. The meeting had been brief, efficient, and unanimous, a clean transition rather than a dramatic coup. His removal as CEO was framed as a strategic realignment, language so neutral it felt insulting. There were no accusations of misconduct, no references to personal failure, only clauses and conditions quietly activated. Victor attempted to appeal, to negotiate, to remind them of his role in building the company's image, but his arguments dissolved against facts he could not dispute. His authority had never been absolute, it had been conditional, and the conditions were no longer in his favor. What haunted Victor was a realization that Amora had designed the process to deny him any narrative of victimhood. There would be no scandal to explain his fall, no enemy to blame publicly, only a man replaced because the system functioned better without him. As he watched the press coverage describe the transition as smooth and necessary, Victor understood that true power does not argue, it simply proceeds. Lagos did not mourn Victor Adebayo. The city absorbed his absence the way it absorbs rain, briefly noticeable, quickly forgotten. Construction project continued under new leadership, suppliers adjusted, investors realigned, and the machine kept moving. Victor walked streets where his presence once commanded attention, now unnoticed, another face in traffic, another man waiting for responses that never came. His phone grew quieter by the day, contacts disappearing not out of cruelty but relevance. Social circles that once revolved around him reorganized seamlessly, proving loyalty had always been transactional. What hurt Victor most was discovering that influence without ownership is temporary, and charisma without structure is disposable. He realized his downfall was not dramatic enough to be remembered, and that anonymity was a harsher punishment than public shame. The city had not betrayed him. It had simply revealed that it never belonged to him either. When Victor returned to the mansion to collect his remaining belongings, the experience felt surreal, as though he were visiting a place from someone else's memory. Security personnel addressed him politely but firmly, guiding him through rooms that once symbolized achievement but now felt hollow. The walls held no warmth, no acknowledgement of his past authority. Amora had removed herself completely, leaving behind a space devoid of emotional residue, a strategic erasure rather than a dramatic exit. Victor noticed how carefully everything had been handled, nothing broken, nothing chaotic, just absence. As he packed, he realized that the house had never been a home, only a stage where he performed success. Being escorted out through gates that once opened at his command forced Victor to confront a painful truth. Control is not proven by possession, but by permanence, and he had neither. Amora's voice returned to the public sphere only once, through a single interview conducted far from Lagos, in a setting that reflected calm rather than conquest. She spoke thoughtfully about partnership preparation and the danger of confusing silence with weakness. She did not accuse Victor, did not expose private details, did not seek sympathy. Her restraint became her statement. Viewers responded not with outrage, but respect, recognizing a woman who had chosen dignity over drama. Victor watched the interview alone, feeling a deeper loss than anger could produce. He saw clearly that Amora's power was not reactionary, it was structural. She had not destroyed him out of spite. She had simply removed herself from a system that no longer served her, allowing it to collapse under its own imbalance. In that moment, Victor finally understood that the loudest downfall is not one announced with chaos, but one carried out with quiet certainty, leaving nothing to argue with and no one left to blame. Victor waited weeks before reaching out, not because he was calm, but because pride needed time to die before desperation could speak. When he finally picked up the phone, his hands trembled in a way they never had during billion-naira negotiations or hostile takeovers. He rehearsed his words repeatedly, deleting messages before sending them, rewriting apologies until they sounded less like excuses and more like accountability. When he finally sent one, it was brief, restrained, and stripped of authority, acknowledging pain, admitting arrogance, asking for a conversation rather than forgiveness. The response did not come. Days passed, then weeks, and the silence pressed on him harder than rejection ever could. Victor tried different channels, emails routed through assistants, messages sent to numbers he wasn't sure were still active, even indirect reach-outs through people he assumed Amora trusted. Every attempt met the same outcome: polite confirmation of receipt, no emotional engagement, no invitation to speak. It became clear that Amora was no longer reacting to Victor at all. She had progressed beyond the phase where explanation mattered. The man who once controlled rooms now found himself pleading for acknowledgement, learning too late that remorse delivered after consequences is often indistinguishable from fear of loss. Victor understood with painful clarity that timing is a form of respect, and as it come long after respect was withdrawn. Without meetings to attend, employees to command, or events to validate his importance, Victor was forced into a quiet routine that felt like punishment disguised as normal life. He woke up without urgency, ate without appetite, and moved through days that offered no structure beyond survival. In this stillness, memories surfaced uninvited, moments where Amora had paused mid-conversation as if weighing whether something was worth saying, moments where she chose restraint instead of reaction. Victor began to see himself through those memories, not as the powerful man he imagined, but as someone who confused attention with affection and dominance with love. He recognized how easily he dismissed emotional labor because it arrived without applause, how he believed provision erased cruelty, how he assumed silence meant consent. This self-realization did not come with relief, only discomfort. Victor understood that growth does not guarantee restoration, and insight does not obligate forgiveness. He could see the man he had been with clarity now, but that clarity came without the ability to reverse damage. The mirror stopped offering excuses, reflecting not a villain, but a man who failed at listening when listening mattered most. When the divorce documents arrived, they did not shock Victor. They confirmed what he already knew but had avoided accepting. The papers were detailed, precise, and painfully fair, outlining separation of assets, dissolution of shared obligations, and finality without bitterness. There were no emotional annotations, no personal accusations, no reminders of betrayal. The language reduced their marriage to a concluded agreement, not a broken love story, and that hurt more than rage ever could. Victor read every line slowly, understanding that Amara had ensured nothing was left ambiguous, nothing open to reinterpretation. This was not an act of revenge. It was closure executed with discipline. Signing the papers felt like admitting defeat without an opponent present. As he returned the documents, Victor realized that what truly ended was not the marriage, but the illusion that emotional damage must always look dramatic. Sometimes, it looks like clarity, structure, and a refusal to reopen wounds for the sake of explanation. Victor's new life did not resemble redemption arcs he had once admired from afar. There was no sudden comeback, no hidden opportunity waiting for him to prove himself again. Instead, there were smaller spaces, quieter conversations, and a constant awareness of limitation. He attended meetings where he listened more than he spoke, accepted roles that required humility rather than authority, and rebuilt routines without the armor of status. Occasionally, he encountered people who knew his past, but spoke to him without reverence or resentment, simply acknowledging him as another man navigating consequence. News of Amara surfaced intermittently, not as scandal, but as progress, her ventures expanding, her reputation solidifying, her story no longer tied to his. Victor learned that being forgotten is not cruelty, it is neutrality. The world did not punish him, it simply stopped revolving around him. In that realization, he discovered that relevance is not permanent and power unanchored to integrity is temporary. There was no final conversation between Victor and Amara, no emotional reunion, no dramatic confrontation to provide narrative satisfaction. The ending arrived quietly, through distance that never closed and silence that remained intact. Victor accepted that some people do not need closure spoken aloud because they have already completed it internally. Amara's absence was not hostility, it was finality. In accepting that, Victor understood the true cause of underestimating someone who chooses preparation over noise. His downfall was not triggered by infidelity alone, but by arrogance layered over years of dismissal. Amara did not destroy him. She stepped away and allowed reality to take its course. As Victor settled into a life stripped of illusion, Amara continued forward unburdened, proving that the most devastating endings are not explosive, but quiet, irreversible, and complete.